Okay, welcome to this event by the Center for Philosophical Studies of History. My name is Georg Gange and I will be today's moderator. Today's speaker is Urs Lindner with the topic, The Uniqueness of the Shoah and the Postcolonial Challenge to German Memory Culture. Urs is a philosopher and currently a junior fellow at the Max Weber Center for Advanced Cultural and Social Studies at the University of Erfurt in Germany. His main research interests lie in affirmative action and its egalitarian justification, Marx and Marxism, and most recently also the philosophical underpinnings and implications of the Uniqueness Thesis of the Shoah. And if I understand his title, of course, correctly, then today's talk will be about the latter topic, the uniqueness of the Shoah. Urs has published widely on all of his three main research interests. On today's topic, he just has very recently published the article Die Singularität der Shoah und die postkoloniale Herausforderung der deutschen Erinnerungskultur, which translates into English just basically like today's title. And this paper was published in German in the journal Geschichte und Gesellschaft, so History and Society. And for Urs's many other publications, also in English and French, I advise you to have a look at this very well-kept homepage at the Max Weber Center for Advanced Cultural and Social Studies. There you definitely also find something of your own interest, I suppose. Now, this is the first session of our spring seminar. After today, in a month's time, roughly, Veli Virmajoki from the University of Turku will be speaking about philosophy as the mapping of conceptual space, the case of causal explanation in history. Then in 2 months' time from now, in the end of April, Veli Lechtenmäki from the University of Oulu and from our own Center for Philosophical Studies of History will be speaking about history of philosophy in practice, some thoughts on historicism and realism. And then finally, around the 10th of May, we will have the talk Sami Histories, Truth and Reconciliation, by Vela-Pekka Lehtola, also from the University of Oulu. And this will be a bigger, also offline event, but there will be a live stream that is done in cooperation together with the Eudaimonia Institute of the University of Oulu. Now, for more information on all these events, I invite you to look at our homepage. There's more information there. And of course, our social media accounts. So we have Facebook and Twitter as well. And I think it's a good idea to follow our social media accounts generally, because beyond the information on the center and our activities, we also try to put out interesting contents concerning the philosophy of history there on a regular basis that you might have seen already. Now, before we start, just a few technicalities. Please mute yourself during the talk so as to avoid any unnecessary disturbance. After Urs' talk, which will go about 45 minutes, I believe, there will be a discussion session that I will also moderate. In the discussion session, if you have a question or a comment, please indicate so first in the chat or by raising your hand in this raising hand function of Zoom. I will make a speakers list. When it's your turn to speak or pose your question, please do so either with or without your camera on, or write it into a chat and I will read it out. And we will prioritize people who have not spoken yet, so they will move up on the speakers list. And then a very final point of order, Urs and us people from the center, we will stay on a bit longer after the official end of this talk. So if you want to chat with us in a more informal fashion or with Urs, then please stay on. All of you are very welcome. Okay, thank you. Urs, please.
Yes, thank you very much for this kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and share my thoughts with you. If I may supplement one point to the introduction, during the last years, I've done a lot of decolonial activism on the ground. So this will, I hope, with regard to certain questions, perhaps illuminate my perspective. I've got a PowerPoint presentation, so I will share the screen now. So it should work. Yes, so my talk is structured into 7 sections. First, I want to begin with some preliminary remarks Then there will be some reflection about the epistemological status of the uniqueness thesis. What kind of statement is this? Then I will present the most important versions in which the uniqueness thesis has been articulated during the last 50 years. Then I will discuss what is the most important, I think, postcolonial criticism of the uniqueness thesis. And this is the question of competitive victimhood, whether the uniqueness thesis leads into such a competition. Then I will present some thoughts about normative consequences. So what follows from the uniqueness thesis, what kind of commitments and perhaps obligations. Then I will reflect on the commemorative function of the uniqueness thesis, at least some, I will develop some thoughts with regard to German memory culture, and then I will conclude. So this is 7 points, but I've got only 2 or 3, sometimes only 1 slide per section, so it should be manageable at least until 4 o'clock of German time, so 5 o'clock Finnish time, or wherever you are. So let me start with my preliminary introductory remarks. For 3 years, around 3 years, nearly 3 years in Germany, we have a very intense controversy about the relationship between Holocaust memory and postcolonialism, the relationship between Nazi and colonial crimes. It started in spring 2020 with some anti-Semitism allegations against Achille Mbembe, who is a leading post-colonial philosopher. He was invited to a cultural festival in the Ruhr region, and then there were some allegations of anti-Semitism, primarily with regard to his argument that what he calls the desire of separation is a common root between South African apartheid, the Holocaust, and also the occupation of the West Bank, Israeli occupation. So in the end, this event did not take place, so the debate somehow ended, but it was finished in at the beginning in February 2021, when Michael Rothberg's book Multidirectional Memory was translated into German, which sets into conversation Holocaust memory and the memory of colonial crimes. Then shortly afterwards, there was the polemic of Dirk Moses. He's here. Hi, Dirk. Called Catechism of the Germans, where Dirk Moses argues that Holocaust memory in Germany has somehow derailed. It's no longer, according to him, a critical practice, but has become a kind of confession with exclusionary effects. So, and there was, of course, not very enthusiastic reaction on this argument. And then last summer in 2022, there was the scandal around the Documenta. The Documenta in Kassel is the most important German art exhibition. And there was one clearly, this last year it was curated by an Indonesian art collective, Ruang Gupa, and there was from another Indonesian art collective there called Taring Padi. There was one banner with a, I would say, clearly anti-Semitic picture element, but there were further pictures, further artifacts that were accused of being anti-Semitic. I haven't seen all of them, so I cannot say whether it's justified or not, especially not with regard to this 3.5-hour propaganda, Palestinian propaganda movie. That was another point, but the discourse around the Documenta was very very polemic, very totalizing with regard to anti-Semitism. So the Documenta by some German liberals was called the Antisemita, and so there were also allegations about that the global South is full of anti-Semitism. So, and of course there was a huge discussion and some defenses and all this, but the debate or what may be called German memory wars continued with the during the Documenta, and I think it's not yet finished now. It has been often framed as a second Historikerstreit, so referring to the controversy from 1986. And of course, there's a discussion about whether this is appropriate term. I'm quite unenthusiastic about this. The main topics of the recent German memory wars, it was actually three. It was the question of the role of colonial violence in explaining the Shoah. Then the second was the relationship between anti-Semitism and racism. And the third was Germany's position towards Israel and Palestine. What was present in all these three topics was the question of today's topic, the question of the uniqueness of the Shoah. What I would like to particularly mention is that in fall 2022, when German journalist and writer, public intellectual Charlotte Wiedemann was invited to Israel in order to present her book, Den Schmerz der anderen begreifen, conceiving the pain of others, the grief of others, perhaps more correct. Then she was invited to Israel, and there should be a presentation where the question of common memory of the Shoah and the Nakba, so during 1948, when Palestinians, during the war for independence of Israel, when Palestinians were expelled or went their homes. So this is called the Nakba, the great tragedy. So the event should set these two events into these two crimes into conversation, and then there were protests from the Israeli ambassador, and then the German Foreign Ministry pressured the Goethe Institute, which was responsible for this event, to that it could not take place. And then the Foreign Ministry declared that the uniqueness of the Shoah must not be questioned at any point in time. So this is the Uniqueness Declaration. And yes, actually what happened with this declaration was that they declared a ban about what the scholarly community has done for decades, and that is debate in a controversial way about the uniqueness thesis, and also, of course, question it. So my main motivation for this talk is that I would say within the entire debate, it is quite unclear what the uniqueness of the Shoah actually means and implies. So I would say, in order to have a have a respectful and perhaps productive controversy in Germany right now, there's a lot of clarification work that has to be done, and I hope that I can modestly contribute to this work. So let me start with the epistemological introduction of what the uniqueness thesis is. Oh, now my camera has some problems. My computer has some problems with Zoom, so it may happen that I start trembling, but now it should be okay again. So actually, there are two types of uniqueness, and they have been called in the year 1980, when this question has already been debated. They have been called ordinary and unique uniqueness, so I would call them, and today this sounds quite ironic, but at that time it was not intended as irony. So I call them uniqueness 1 and uniqueness 2. So uniqueness 1 means that every mass crime has particular features. So this is quite obvious, I think. And uniqueness 2, what is the proper uniqueness thesis, means that the Shoah is a particularly horrifying mass crime and has world historical significance. So I would say when the debate is about the uniqueness thesis, then it's not about uniqueness 1, but about uniqueness 2. And of course, the question is, how do we get from uniqueness 1 to uniqueness 2? Many people think that we can do this by historical comparison, but I would say the historical comparison is already consummated by uniqueness 1 in order to establish particular features of all mass crimes. So it cannot be done by that. And I would say we get from uniqueness 1 to uniqueness 2 only by a process of ethical reflection, balancing particular features of mass crime. So the uniqueness thesis, I would say, is a comparative value judgment. And of course, the question is, there has been different wordings. To what extent is different wording relevant? Of course, the term unprecedentedness may clarify that something like the Shoah, something very similar, may repeat, but I would say expect on this. In the end, it does not matter which term you use. It's all about the question, how do you get from uniqueness 1 to uniqueness 2? So if you call it singularity, or if you call it unparalleledness, I think this sounds strange in English, but at least the adjectives are present in the discussion. I recently read from one historian. He said, okay, it did not refer to the Shoah in particular, but to all Nazi mass crimes. He said, okay, they were not unique, but they were unparalleled. So, but I think this does, in the end, this is a play with words, and we should simply focus on the question how to get from unique 1 to unique 2. I think it's the genocide which took place in Rwanda in 1994 is is an important test case, because this genocide has some features of uniqueness one, where the ethical significance is very obvious. So when we talk about the uniqueness of the Rwanda genocide, then what is really unique is that it has been some kind of popular genocide. So the participation of neighbors and broad parts of the Hutu population, and of course the speed of the killing. So up to 1 million people within 3 months is quite unique in such a small country additionally. So, and this obviously has ethical significance, and I would say everyone who wants to defend the uniqueness thesis has to take this ethical significance seriously. And of course, this makes the uniqueness thesis a quite complicated value judgment. So there are, in the debate, there are different, what I would call certainties, which explain the polemical character of the debate. I think it's mainly it's 3 certainties. So of course, certainties, I borrowed this term from John Dewey, The Quest for Certainty, great book about the philosophy of modern history. So what I would call the empiricist certainty is that the uniqueness thesis is a factual statement. So this is mostly the certainty of the proponents of the uniqueness thesis. So the uniqueness can be read from the fact, so, and is not an ethical process of balancing. And of course, if it can be read from the facts, then those who question the uniqueness thesis will trivialize the Shoah and engage in something like post-truth. So this, for me, this certainty explains why proponents of the uniqueness thesis often get so wild when the uniqueness thesis is questioned. So there's another certainty that I would call the skeptical certainty. And this means that there are no objective standards for ethically balancing particularities of uniqueness one. So according to this certainty, proponents of the uniqueness thesis are pretty naive. This is the position I've last fall. There was a great interview on Deutschlandfunk with Wolf Kahnsteiner, who was also at your center in Oulu, and this was his position towards the uniqueness thesis. And there's a third, what I would call the critical certainty. One can find this often with postcolonial scholars, that the uniqueness thesis is a particular frame for understanding the Shoah. So according to this certainty, the proponents of the uniqueness thesis totalize and prioritize legitimate Jewish and German identity claims, and thereby producing exclusions again and again. So actually, I found this in a very good essay by Dan Stone, which is already 20 years old. This was his position, and I think this is shared by many postcolonial critics. So what I would like to invite you is to question all 3 certainties. So I think against the first certainty, I would argue and focus on that the uniqueness thesis is a comparative value judgment, so it's not a factual statement. And the second certainty, I would add that it's on all things considered. judgment, so that we have to balance different kinds of goods and evil. At least in political philosophy, this is something of ordinary work, and I think it's also characteristic for political judgment, or let's use Hannah Arendt's phrase, denken ohne Geländer. So this is, and of course, there are no absolutely sure, secure objective standards, but ethical reasoning, rationality is, I think, is beyond the dichotomy of skepticism, pure skepticism, and absolute certainty. It's in between. So this is, I think, quite common. It's an all things considered judgment, and this would be my invitation to my postcolonial friends to consider this. It allows for different interpretive frames. So we have to distinguish between the value judgment and different frames making sense of it. So my third point is about different versions of the uniqueness thesis. So I would say the uniqueness thesis is not always the same thing. And I would, I would differentiate between three types. And I found particularly helpful this article by Nigel Pleasance, the question of the Holocaust uniqueness, was it something more or different? From genocide from 2016. So it's three types. The first is what I would call the incommensurable type. So according to this type, the Shoah is incomprehensible and cannot be compared. So this is an argument about incomparability. So the second type of the uniqueness thesis, I would call it categorical. So according to this type, the Shoah constitutes a special type of mass crime, or to use the phrase by philosopher Norman Jarrus, it's a class of its own. And the third type is what I would call the instantiating type. So the Shoah is a special event within an existing category. And obviously, these are different types, and the question is, do these differences matter? To what extent do they matter? So actually, I would say we have these three types, and we have two different modes of presenting them. And I would say in the history of the uniqueness thesis, yes, the most important options can be summarized in 6 versions. The incommensurable type has 2 versions. One is that of the epistemic black box. The first one who developed this view was Isaac Deutscher, and in the late 1960s, or at least the one I found, or probably there were some earlier, and was during the historians Historikerstreit, Michael Rothberg advocated this version of the uniqueness thesis, and especially important also for the current debate is Dandina's elaboration. It's also already from 1987, where Dina argues, okay, the Shoah is characterized by a particular counter-rationality. So Dina argues the Shoah was destruction for the destruction's sake, was annihilation without a purpose. And of course, and this is still a position that is present in the debate. I must say I find it extremely unconvincing, because the Shoah had a clear purpose, and this was the purpose of redemptive anti-Semitism, to create a world without Jews. So this is, I think, one of the problems with Dina's argument. The other version of the incommensurable type, I would call it metaphysical transcendence. This was a position presented by Elie Wiesel already in the 70s, where he argued that the Shoah is situated beyond history. So the second type, one version is the class of its own argument, beyond genocides. So this was primarily presented by Yehuda Bauer, Israeli historian, already in 1978. So Bauer was strongly against the incomparability thesis. So he said, okay, the Shoah can be compared to other mass crimes, but if we do this, then we found out that the Shoah is something beyond genocide. His main arguments were that genocide is always only about partial destruction, whereas the Shoah was intended as total destruction of a people, and that the Shoah was purely or primarily ideology driven. So this is a very particular concept of genocide that is that is something different from, for example, the UN Declaration on Genocide, where total destruction, the intent of total destruction, is clearly within the concept of genocide. And so the other version was already proposed by Stephen Katz in 1981, but also Eberhard Jäckel during the first Historikerstreit, was to say, okay, the Shoah is the one and only genocide, and all other, what we would call genocide today, they are not true genocide. So Jäckel said, okay, the genocide of the Armenians, that was deportation with combined with some killings, but not genocide. And the third type, again, two versions that are very different. So one is, and this is I think the most plausible version of the uniqueness thesis, was presented by Alan Rosenberg in 1987, that is, the Shoah was a genocide, but had certain features that may be justified to call the Shoah an unprecedented genocide. And the other version is, perhaps for some of you it's surprising, I would say Ernst Nolte in the Historikerstreit also yes, kind of proposed a version of the uniqueness thesis, of course completely Orientalist, that he said, okay, or one can reconstruct him in this way, that the Shoah was an unprecedented Asiatic action. So Nolte argued that the Nazis, that the Shoah was an Asiatic action, and the Nazis reacted to the Bolshevist terror. That was for the Nazis the original that they copied, but the true original, according to Nolte, was the genocide of the Armenians that was copied by the Bolshevists. So this is clear. Asiatic action does not refer to China, but to regions primarily where Muslim people live. And of course, there's with Nolte this history with the Wittfogel Oriental despotism. I think there are many links to kind of Orientalist Marxism. by the way, those who don't know, that Wittfogel was one of the one of the founding members of the Frankfurt School, but this is a separate story. He later became a theorist of totalitarianism. Actually, I think these 6 versions, now I start trembling again, these 6 versions can be boiled down to 3 different frames. So the first frame is, I would call it the apologetic frame, and this was Nolte's entire operation to use the uniqueness thesis as a vehicle for externalizing German responsibility, because the origin of the Shoah lies elsewhere. Habermas in the first Historikerstreit said so, denied that there's a uniqueness thesis in Nolte. He said, okay, Nolte has reduced the uniqueness to a technical innovation, but I would say this is a misreading, because Nolte clearly argues with intent. So it's not about not only about techniques of mass killing, and quite so in the recent German debate, there was often the argument, okay, now it's post-colonial scholars who are the successors of Nolte, but I would say the most important successor of Nolte is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, when he, in 2015, when he argued that the Shoah originally was an idea by the Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini. So Hitler only took up this idea from the Mufti. So this is, of course, also a kind of externalizing German responsibility and clearly projecting the responsibility for the Shoah on Palestinian people. So the second frame is what may be called different logics. The different logics frame, this is a term from Dirk Moses. So according to this frame, the Shoah is the only mass crime in history aiming at total destruction of a minority population, and it's motivated by ideology and hatred, not by pragmatic and instrumental rationality. So I think this kind of frame, one can actually both the incommensurable and the categorical type of the uniqueness thesis, although they are different, they unite in this different logics frame. So this frame, the most important proponents are Yehuda Bauer and Dandina, and recently also in Germany, Götz Ali, German historian Götz Ali, has argued in this way. And the third frame is what I would like to call the extreme case frame. So according to this frame, the Shoah is located on a continuum of mass crimes, but it has particular traits that may be, all things considered, seen as particularly monstrous. So this is, I would say, the frame from Alan Rosenberg and what many memory activists in Germany on the ground would argue. So I would say the extreme case frame is the only frame that is in tune with historical research. So many critics of the uniqueness thesis actually argue exactly along these lines. The problem of the different logics frame is that this intent for total destruction is simply not a particularity of the Shoah in terms of uniqueness one. It can also be found with the genocide of the Tutsis in Rwanda, and of course, additionally, this dichotomy between ideology on the one hand and pragmatic rationality does not make sense, because all mass crimes are kind of mixtures of ideology and pragmatic purposes. So I would say within the extreme case frame, the critical ethical significance is it's particularly three traits that are significant in this way. So on the one hand, first, it's that the Shoah there was no real conflictual dynamic, but that it was a kind of imagined fantasy conflictual dynamic. So only to make the comparison with the Rwanda genocide, when the Shoah happened, there was not a Jewish army at the German border, and it was not 20 years before the Shoah. It was not Jews who committed a genocide of the Germans. So that would be the analogy to the genocide in Rwanda, but it was imagined in the way that the real conflict between fascism and Bolshevism was seen as one that involved the Jews, because according to the anti-Semitic projection, the Jews were behind Bolshevism. So this is one important difference. The other is the variety and the development of killing techniques. As you know, the Holocaust started first with what is called the Holocaust of the bullets. So mass killings by shooting, and then there came the gas wagons, and then it came only the death camps. And so it's this pure variety and the development to perfectionize the killing techniques that may be of particular ethical significance. And the third is, this is an important term from Roberta Perger and Mark Roseman, has played no role in the German debate, is that the Holocaust was an imperial genocide, that that Jews were persecuted through the entire Nazi empire, and that the resources of the entire empire were used to destroy them. So it's an alternative concept to the Shoah as a colonial genocide, what I think is, yes, quite unplausible. I think this imperial genocide is yes, a very interesting concept that needs further elaboration. But of course, the question then is, if you have a look at the Primos, so the genocide of Roma population, all these three particularities, you can find them also within the Primos. And although it's a bit complicated, but it's, I would say, in the end, or that is what historical research says today, there was some total intent of total destruction, so of the Roma people. So perhaps it's more adequate to talk about, if you want to defend the uniqueness thesis, talk about the uniqueness of the Holocaust, including the Primos. So the question of, I have to look, hurry up, speed up a bit, of competitive victimhood. So this is the central, one of the central criticisms of from the post-colonial perspective. So one may first wonder what could competitive victimhood, hierarchical victimhood, what could this actually mean? So I think, sorry, this is too quick. So one candidate would be suffering, that the uniqueness thesis is about hierarchizing suffering. The problem simply, and this is why no one likes comparative suffering, that there are no criteria for comparison. Suffering is highly subjective and always kind of absolute. So the interesting thing is that Dandiner and Stephen Katz, so leading proponents of the uniqueness thesis, they are quite unequivocal in their rejection of comparative suffering. So if it's not suffering, perhaps it's innocence. So the argument then would be Jews are the only absolute victims, whereas all other genocide victims are only relatively innocent. I think there's kind of an affinity between the different logics frame and this hierarchy of innocence. But if I read recent, especially an article from Dandiner from 2021, I'm really not sure whether he believes in this. There's some kind of evidence that in a book from 2007, he has advocated such a view, but it's unclear whether he still believes in this. I think there's no necessary connection between the uniqueness thesis and the as a value judgment and the hierarchy of innocence. I think it proposes to go there an additional theory of ethnic guilt, some kind of normative collectivism where you think, okay, let's say children from the Tutsi community, they are kind of not absolutely innocent because there was some real social conflict, and the Tutsi had committed some crimes, whereas the Jews had not committed similar or analogical crimes, and so they are absolutely innocent, and the Tutsi children are only relatively innocent. So I think this kind of, for me, this is a very spurious and not very plausible kind of reasoning, but perhaps this is what is how some people think who defend a hierarchy of innocence. But perhaps it's not about victimhood, sorry, but it's about it's about hierarchizing mass crimes. So there are, I would say, three ways of morally dealing with the differences between mass crimes. The first would be a comprehensive hierarchy with the Shoah on the top. The second option would be a hierarchy between different types of mass crimes with a threshold of ultimate evil where no more hierarchization is possible. So this threshold classically would be genocide and also transatlantic slavery. This is how I understand Black Jewish philosopher Lawrence Mordecai Thomas in a great book from 1993, Vessels of Evil. Or the third option would be, okay, it's difficult to hierarchize mass crimes. So there's no hierarchy. We should assume no hierarchy at all. I think it's here with this, at this point, the differences between the frames become important. So the different logics frame amounts to the first option. Of course, if the Shoah is a separate category of mass crime, then it's quite plausible to place it at the top. Whereas I would say the extreme case frame can be combined with both this kind of uneven hierarchy or the no hierarchy option. So it's a value judgment and not a moral judgment about how to hierarchize mass crimes. I would quickly reflect with you on one phrase, one statement that is very common in the German debate, and this is that people say, okay, but the Shoah wasn't just another genocide or mass crime. Is this a reasonable statement? Actually, I do not think so, because it's kind of true in a very banal sense, that you can articulate the statement about every genocide. So, of course, the genocide in Rwanda was not just another mass genocide. The same is true with the genocide of the Armenians. So either it's kind of banal because it's true for every kind of mass crime, or of course it's kind of repulsive because, and demeaning, because then you say, okay, the Shoah wasn't just another genocide, but all other genocides are just another genocide. So it's either banal or quite problematic. And so I would not use it. And of course, this is not my own thought. All this can be found in a great article by Mark Leveny from 1994, titled The Holocaust, Just Another Genocide. So my fifth point on the normative consequences, there are three possible domains. One is the question of the universalization of Holocaust memory, on this more on the next slide. The second is on the reparation claims of victims of German or other mass crimes. I would say simply, if you use the uniqueness thesis to deny such claims, then it's simply a misuse, because it's a value judgment and not a moral claim about reparations. And the third domain would be the stance towards Israel and Palestine. And of course, I would say there's a statistical correlation of the uniqueness thesis with indifference towards the Palestinian condition. So many people who advocate the uniqueness thesis, they, I would say, simply do not care about or do not care enough about the Palestinian condition. But I would refer also to Dandino, and this time in a very positive way, because with him, he's quite clear that he says, okay, we cannot deny the Nakba. It's kind of what he calls a foundational crime of the Israeli state. So I think there as well, there's not a necessary connection between the uniqueness thesis and a certain stance towards Israel and Palestine. So let me quickly give you some reflections about the universalization of Holocaust memory. So empirically, we have a globalization of Holocaust memory, which is part of Western hegemony. This is, I think, really pretty obvious. But the interesting for me as a philosopher, the interesting question is, what would a true cosmopolitan universalization imply? I think it implies two things. First, a uniqueness thesis according to the extreme case frame. So in order that the Holocaust can work as a universal signifier, the Holocaust has to be in some way as particularly monstrous, but on a continuum with other mass crimes. So actually, it's only the extreme case frame that works for the universalization of Holocaust memory. And if it's true universalization, I would say there has to be the strongest possible connection between the Holocaust and colonial crimes. So what I find very interesting, again from Dirk Moses' recent book, The Problems of Genocide, that with the Nazis there was kind of fusion between redemptive anti-Semitism and redemptive imperialism. So this is exactly, if you read Friedlander on redemptive anti-Semitism, still I think it's great what he writes and analyzes. But what is interesting, what's missing is already in the early 1920s when the Nazis developed their redemptive anti-Semitic ideology. It was already in the sense that that the Jews are responsible for dominating the Germans, for keeping the Germans away from imperial power, from the imperial grip to the world. So I think we need a much closer, we need to think redemptive anti-Semitism and redemptive imperialism together. And so, of course, this connects the Holocaust to colonial crimes. I would say this is kind of speculative, of course, a bit. The Holocaust was a kind of meta-genocide for the continuation of colonialism, and it was against the idea of human equality. So for this reason, I think with these elements, one could argue for the universalization. And what I think is an important point is that the Holocaust includes a message about racism in general. So this what Dan Stone recently argued. And of course, this is a critical statement towards current German memory culture, because if you argue that anti-Semitism is not a racism, then you can no longer say, okay, it has the Shoah has a message about racism in general. So I think this is quite an important point, and according to this, we would think about redemptive anti-Semitism as an, again, extreme case on a racist continuum. So my last section, it's only one more slide on the commemorative function. I would suggest to think about German memory culture in Gramscian terms, or more in Gramscian terms. Antonio Gramsci, the Marxist philosopher. So a common argument is that the uniqueness thesis needs a kind of historization. So it has had a progressive function for demarginalizing the Shoah memory in the 1980s, but now it has turned reactionary for some years, and it is especially incompatible with today's post-migration society. This is the view of many, but perhaps Susan Neiman is an important advocate of this view. I would say it's a rather schematic, big package view, and I think we should place a stronger emphasis on possible negotiation and compromise. So it's quite interesting, in the early 1990s, the uniqueness thesis and the memory of the GDR dictatorship were first in tension, and then there was a process of accommodation. What it makes more complicated today is that we have a global context of rising right-wing forces that, on the one hand, attack the Shoah memory. This is clear, but on the other hand, they use it primarily against Muslims. So this is right-wing hijacking of memory. I would say what is important is to view the German memory culture not as a monolithic block, but as yes, including both hegemonic and counter-hegemonic tendencies and practices. This is Michael Rothberg has started with an analysis along these lines in a recent article. I think this is of course Gramsci. I think this is kind of promising. And then if you think about this, these lines that about memory culture as kind of unstable and contingent, then of course the question might be whether the uniqueness thesis may be part of a new decolonial chain of equivalence, or to use this term from Laclau Mouffe, that it can be articulated with decolonial concerns. So this may be a possible point of intervention if you hold this view. So my conclusion would be, I think the political question addressed to my postcolonial friends, it is clearly this: should postcolonial critics continue attacking the uniqueness thesis, or should they contribute to its internal transformation, making the uniqueness thesis consistent with historical research and universalist egalitarian morality? So I think I already indicated how this could be, how this could work. And of course, the presupposition for the second option is twofold. So first, the question is, does this distinction between the uniqueness thesis as a value judgment and its use in different interpretive frames, does this distinction make sense? And the second is the extreme case a meaningful frame for interpreting the uniqueness thesis as a comparative ethical value judgment? And if it is, then of course extreme becomes yet another term for unique, or it is at least close to it. And I would argue that those who yes, advocate this extreme case view, even if they are criticizing the uniqueness thesis, at least they kind of yes, exhibit a kind of crypto uniqueness thesis. Crypto uniqueness thesis, of course, is reference to Habermas' critique of Foucault, when Habermas accused Foucault of crypto-normativism. So then the question might be, what is the main conceptual blockage? Conceptual blockage, again, from Dirk Moses. Is it the uniqueness thesis in current German memory culture, or is it perhaps the separation of antisemitisms from racism in general? So I would say the argument that is also quite current in the contemporary German debate, that anti-Semitism is not just another racism. It's as meaningless as that the Shoah was not just another genocide, because again, it's banal true about every racism. So you can say, you can argue anti-Black racism is not just another racism. So, or it's demeaning to say in the sense that you would argue, okay, yes, that all other racisms are just another racism, whereas the Shoah is does not meet this standard. So I would close with two arguments in favor of the uniqueness thesis. The first is democratic memory cultures, and not only in Germany, but I think globally, are right now in a quite fragile state, primarily due to ongoing right-wing attacks. And so the question is, and this is the strategic question, is what does it do to these memory cultures if postcolonial critics attack the uniqueness thesis? May they perhaps in the end weaken both the memory of the Holocaust and colonial crimes? So this is a question of strategy, and of course postcolonial authors may reply, so it's not us who behave irresponsible, but it's those liberals who accuse us to be anti-Semites and to destroy the Shoah memory and all this stuff. So I think, of course, this reply has a truth, but nevertheless, the question is, how should you react to such a reply? Should you react by the same means, or should you use a kind of different strategy? And so that would be the question: Can an anti-racism in Germany, can it be credible if it attacks the uniqueness thesis? And the second argument would be, and this is, I try to show, that the universalist never again only works with a kind of uniqueness thesis of the extreme case frame. So what do I mean by never universalist, never again? I would say it means something like that never again should human beings be victims of racism. If this is the universalist never again, then on the one hand you need a kind of uniqueness thesis, and on the other hand you have to reconnect the critique of anti-Semitism to the critique of racism. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
All right, thank you, Urs. Maybe you can unshare your presentation and then it's easier to see. Right, so is there any immediate comments, questions, concerns, interjections? Oh yeah, Aviesa Taka, please.
Yeah, hi.
Hello.
I'm trying to turn on. Right, here you see. Okay, I'm going to ask you the kind of question that I hate when people ask me sometimes, but it has to be asked. What's the philosophy here? Because you are describing basically a political debate between several groups that I find quite unsavory. What would be the philosophical intervention? Because I made sort of a list of 4 sort of fallacies that I would have highlighted if I was in this debate. One is the misuse of the word memory. Memory, of course, in German, Gedanken, French memoir is different than the English memory, which is far more narrow. To have a memory in English, you have to experience something first. And we're not talking here about people who experience the Holocaust one way or the other, debating what happened to them, what they remember. What we are talking is about beliefs that are testimonially based. It's the epistemology of testimony, not the epistemology of memory. That's kind of a misrepresentation of the debate. Secondly, the way that you put it, the ability to move from uniqueness 1 to uniqueness 2 is basically just a version of the naturalistic fallacy. You cannot derive an ought from an is. Uniqueness 1 is an is, and uniqueness 2 is an ought. So of course you can't derive it. The way that you put it is in terms of here I'm going to discuss a logical fallacy. Number 3, the fallacy of affirming the consequence. That is, if you have similar effect, it does not imply they have similar causes. So if Rwanda is similar to Auschwitz, it doesn't mean that they have a similar causal structure behind them. There's no such implication at all. So the whole debate, this framing debate, is based on another logical fallacy. And fourthly, there is the question, more interesting perhaps, a philosophical question of what is relevant comparative historiography. That is, what kind of comparisons historians should make which are somehow logically consistent and enlightening. Because of course, everything is like everything else. There were people, the sun was shining, the wind was blowing. That's true for all historical events, but it's a boring comparison. What is a relevant or interesting comparison? And I would say there are two such generally. One is to show the difference. There is one thing, you understand what is something by showing that it is not like something else. And secondly is the kind of comparisons that we work with in the social sciences. That is to say, you find similar causes, industrialization, nationalism, and you see what kind of similar processes they have, and that helps you confirm or deny general social science theories about that. And again, that's not something that comes up in this comparison, because what we have here is sort of radical politicization, which is really not even part of proper historiography. You have 3 or 4 groups of politicians who are debating this. You have the people who are excusing totalitarianism. It's true for communism as well as for Nazism, by saying, hey, what we or our parents or our ideological forebears were doing is quite similar to what the liberals are doing and what the liberal empires were doing. So you can't blame us for anything. Or the other totalitarians, that is, the Nazis blame the communists blame the Nazis, and nobody is responsible. Then you have a group of people who really hate the guts of liberalism and Western civilization and the whole thing. And like Heidegger, they want a new beginning. So they don't have an alternative. They don't have any, Marxism is gone, so they can't really come up with that alternative. So what they say, well, everything is like everything else. Liberalism is like Nazism, and we need a new beginning. Let's forget about that. And then finally, these Israeli nationalists who excuse what they do to the Palestinians by saying, well, look what the Nazis did to us. That's so unique. What we do to the Palestinians is not so unique, as if that justifies anything. Okay, that's pretty boring from a philosophical perspective. Politicians usually say silly things and try to excuse terrible policies. Or so why is that would be of philosophical interest? Unless we say, well, here's a theory of comparative historiography. This is how we should. These are the kind of comparisons that are fair and enlightening, and we can infer properly interesting conclusions from them, unlike this kind of politicization. I spoke too much already. Thank you.
Georg, shall I reply?
I think there's currently no other questions, so feel free to reply to whichever part or all parts that you would like to reply. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. So this was a lot of stuff, and I'm not sure whether I can reply to all of your concerns adequately. So the first, or your general point was, so what is the philosophy in what I have presented? I would clearly say philosophy is about, or at least this is an important part, it's about conceptual clarification. And this is what I have tried to do in this talk, is the debate about the uniqueness thesis. It's a kind of bundle where many different questions are confused, and so my primarily work was to disentangle this bundle and to make distinctions that may make sense, that may enlighten, that may enrich perhaps politicians, perhaps civil society activists, perhaps historians. So actually, this is kind of understanding of philosophy as an under-laborer, so famous concept from John Locke. So, and for this, and of course, I have this conceptual clarification. I have done this with respect to the epistemology of the uniqueness thesis. So I would say this is genuine philosophical question, and of course, with regard to its normativity. So your first point, what you said about memory. I'm not a philosopher of memory, so I'm not sure whether I can say anything interesting to your first concern. I think it's a different concern from my topic. Your second point with the naturalistic fallacy, there I have, of course, a very strong opinion that the assumption of the naturalist fallacy is itself a fallacy. So informed ethical reflection is not about deriving ought from is, but it's about informing ethical evaluations. So if we, and this is something very different. It's not, of course, if you want to derive or develop an ought, this is an additional step, but there's simply not, I would say, not this unbridgeable gap that positivists have always claimed, because between facts and values. But that's a very, I think, yes, this is a huge debate, but my position is there is simply, I completely disagree with you. Your third point on comparisons, when is a comparison interesting? I think, and we talk now about historical comparisons, right? Or comparisons in the social sciences. And of course, we cannot, or of course we can, but then it's not interesting to compare everything with everything. But I would say at least it's possible to compare mass crimes that are usually classified as genocides. So that may be enlightening, and you're completely right if you emphasize, when you refer to Rwanda and the Shoah, the contextual differences, they are enormous, but nevertheless one can make comparisons, because comparisons are not only about context, but about what actually happened, about the processes, about its outcomes. And so I would say, yes, we always have to consider the question that a comparison becomes uninteresting and unenlightening, or perhaps also sometimes in an ethical sense problematic. But I don't see that this is the case when we compare genocides. And your fourth point was about the politics of the debate. Yes, you're completely right. It's extremely politicized, and there's a lot of misuse, but it's not only a debate that is led by politicians. It's also something in Germany. Also, historians have engaged in this debate. It's a public debate with different voices, and I think to say, okay, this is so politicized, let's stay away from this debate. This is something that, at least I don't think this is a sensible move. I would say, okay, we have to engage with this debate, and of course, what is important is that we start with some kind of clarifications in order that the debate can be led in a meaningful way and not full of misunderstandings, full of full of certainties that cannot communicate with each other. But yes, we need to start, and I think we need to start with some clarifications, and this is what I have tried to do in this talk.
Thank you, Urs, and thank you, Aviesa. Is there any other immediate comment, question, concern? Yes, there's Wolf Kannsteiner. Please, Wolf.
Yes, I'm just waiting for my machine to also render me visible. Perfect. Yes, a very interesting paper. I have to apologize. I was running from a meeting and therefore I'm a little late. One clarification, perhaps from a perspective of a memory scholar. The term memory in English, of course, can designate phenomena that are not directly linked to things experienced. The whole literature about social memory, collective memory is all about, very often about events and the memory of events that are not linked to any kind of personal experience. My point is about the political situation in Germany, and also about your reading of the political situation. You say, there could be, the argument has been used, it has been used quite often, that in this current fragile state of German cosmopolitan or self-reflexive memory, it is very important to hold on to the uniqueness theory in order to defend the accomplishments of German memory culture. I would be curious how you see the situation, if that's where the situation is in Germany. It seems to also raise the question, well, yeah, this is about a democratic memory culture, so shouldn't one perhaps then just ask people about what type of memory they prefer? And if that's an honest and open-ended question, there might be a democratic decision against a kind of very specific interpretation of one set of events. So there might also be actually a tension between the very idea of a democratic culture on the one hand and the uniqueness thesis. But I would like to just know where you would like us to go, what kind of political strategy, advice you might have for Germans and people beyond, and if what also you think is likely to happen in the coming years. Because at the moment there's this interesting situation, as I see it, based outside of Germany but closely tuned into German discussions, that the German memory scene is on its kind of Sonderweg tangent, where memory in Germany is constructed quite differently from memory cultures also in many other Western democracies. So that makes for a very interesting situation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for this question. I think actually it were several questions. What is my view on current German memory culture? So yes, I see this tendency of a Sonderweg, what you mentioned, as well, but there are also countervailing tendencies. So I think it's quite open, and for me the question first in terms of diagnosis is what is, and this is what I kind of hinted to on the last slide of the presentation. So what is the main problem right now, or what is maybe the main conceptual blockage? And I have the impression it's this kind of separation of anti-Semitism from racism, and it has, I would say, it has two effects. That first, it makes extremely difficult to develop anti-racist alliances. So alliances between for example, Jews and Muslims. So between different minorities against the German majority society, we were already at a, I would say, further or a better point, let's say, in the 1990s, where guys, for example, like Ignaz Bubis or Michel Friedman, they consistently, rigorously worked towards such an alliance, and these kind of alliances, they have kind of broken due to this separation thesis of anti-Semitism and racism, which took hold of German public debates, I would say, in the early 2000s, and it's becoming stronger and stronger. So it's kind of nearly also with liberals, of course, but also with leftists, it's kind of common sense that anti-Semitism is something different from racism. Anti-Semitism is not racism. So this is one effect. The other is that I would say, of course, if you separate anti-Semitism from racism, then the question is what may be the critical function of Shoah memory today. You can, for example, not connect Shoah memory to a critique of the European border regime, because if you do that, then you're trivializing the Shoah, you trivialize anti-Semitism. And but of course, if you think about racism, of redemptive anti-Semitism as an extreme case of racism, and therefore also that the Shoah has a message about racism in general, then things are different. So this is kind of, I think this is for me, this is the proper problem right now, or this is the most difficult tendency of German memory culture at the moment, because, you know, with the Sonderweg, I think during the last 2 or 3 years, one could see in this Historikerstreit some kind of development. So it's kind of consensual within historians that the Nazi Vernichtungskrieg, extermination war in the East had colonial aspects. So this is kind of new, because German historians, especially with this article, which has been quoted again and again from Robert Gerbert and Malinowski, 2008, there was this argument, okay, yes, what the Nazis did in the East that was so different from colonialism, so this was not colonialism, and this has changed. So in this respect, I would say, okay, it's not German historians are able to learn, at least to a particular extent, and to engage with the global state of the art in Holocaust research and research of Nazi mass crimes. So perhaps I'm not that pessimistic. If you ask me about what my favorite option would be, I would say anti-racists in Germany, they should not attack the uniqueness thesis, but kind of reappropriate it along the lines of what I have called the extreme case frame. And then in the end, guys like us, we may have the following option. If we speak to an international audience, we can say, okay, the Holocaust was an extreme case, and for Germans, or for some Germans, and for some Jews, it's important to call this extreme case unique. And if we speak to a German audience, then we can say, okay, we're fine with the uniqueness thesis under the condition that it is framed according to this extreme case on a continuum frame and not according to the different logics frame. So I would say anti-racist and decolonial activists, scholars, they should re-engage with the uniqueness thesis and make it compatible with research, what we know about the Holocaust and with egalitarian political morality.
Okay, thank you, Urs. Next question is from Henrika, and then we have another one in the chat, but first Henrika, please.
Okay, thanks. So thanks a lot for the talk. It was really interesting, a very sort of complicated topic, sort of very clearly presented. So I was just thinking that one could, I think, imagine a version of the uniqueness thesis that relativizes kind of the uniqueness to German memory culture, that you could make the case that in the particular case of German memory culture, the Holocaust or Shoah always has like plausibly has to have like a unique place because of the unique responsibility. I mean, it's not just Germany, it would also be in the, but Germany just happens to be the place where people think about the memory culture a lot, but yeah. So this sort of relativized uniqueness, that would be kind of a different thing than then sort of the kind of more universal moral considerations about the uniqueness thesis. So I don't know, this is kind of an open question. Does this sort of a position feature in the discussion at all, or what would you make of it, or so on?
It features prominently because I think this is actually the position of Omer Bartov, important Holocaust historian, who says he was always against the uniqueness thesis as a kind of, yes, let's call it value judgment with some claims for universal validity. But he says, okay, the uniqueness is important for Jews as the victims of the Holocaust, and for Germans as the perpetrator, or at least today we know that the Holocaust was kind of had many collaborations from other non-German social groups, but of course it's clear it was German-led, so it's primarily a German crime. And so Bartov says, okay, it has a particular, of course, for that, if Germans want to be in any way, if they refer to their history, they do this through this uniqueness thesis, and this may engage them, help them to engage with their history in a critical way. So he would say it's important for Jews and Germans, but of course also for German Jews, this is not kind of, don't mean it in the sense that there are no German Jews, but beyond Germans and Jews, the uniqueness thesis is wrong. I think this is Bartov's position, and of course Bartov is an important figure. I would say it figures prominently in the debate.
Right, thank you, Urs. We got another question in the chat, and I will read it out, so that it's also on our recording. Okay, it is from Moira Perez. She thanks you first. And then the question is, in line with what you're saying about the separation between anti-Semitism and racism, don't you think that this is also functional to legitimize German state policies and society, which would have dealt correctly with anti-Semitism post-World War II, and therefore morally dignified, while discussions on racism and of moral responsibility are just ignored until recently? that is the case, then continuing to use the uniqueness thesis is detrimental to an anti-racist agenda. I guess the question is the current use of the uniqueness thesis detrimental to an anti-racist agenda? Maybe if I understand correctly.
Yes and no, because I would say there are different uses. And of course, the use against the use according to the different logics frame is strongly opposed to, or at least to a certain anti-racism, because there the argument is, okay, what anti-racists do, for example, if they think about the Holocaust is according to the extreme case frame, then they are trivializing the Holocaust, because the Holocaust and the Shoah, to be more correct, the Shoah was not just another genocide. So, and in this sense, there's a use of the uniqueness thesis that produces the view that postcolonial scholars or scholars critical of the uniqueness thesis, that they want to attack Holocaust memory. So, and that anti-racists in general have a problem with anti-Semitism, or they're even themselves anti-Semites. So this is how the debate runs. And what I would say, okay, yes, I think what you are doing, making these allegations, it's irresponsible if we have in mind how Holocaust memory is currently attacked from the right. And I think, yes, anti-racists should not react to this, by the way, okay, we are against the uniqueness thesis, but reappropriate it for themselves. And what I have tried to show is, or what I wanted to make clear with this talk, is that such a reappropriation can work without yes, producing competitive victimhood, without producing a comprehensive hierarchy of mass crimes. So yes, this would be my reply. It depends on the use of the uniqueness thesis according to which frame.
Okay, thank you, Urs. We are pretty advanced on time, but there's been a great discussion, so that's great. Is there Joni-Matti? I would also have another question, but Joni-Matti, you first, and then we'll see if we still have time. We might.
Okay, thank you. Do you hear me, right? Yeah. Okay, thanks for the great talk. I'm seeking a clarification regarding the uniqueness thesis 1 and 2, and because I couldn't see the sort of qualitative difference between 1 and 2. If we, and I try to give some grounds, if we begin with the idea that the historical event is unique, so if it's a study of the particular, so we get to the view that absolutely anything that happened in history is unique, so you don't get a difference there. And then why would you need, on the other hand, why would you need any ethical dimension at all? I mean, you could historically just maybe come to a conclusion that this Shoah, the Holocaust, was unique because it was, for example, there was a premeditation, or it was particularly effective, or just unprecedented in scale. So, you know, you can just describe, or you can just arrive to this conclusion, and that makes it unique as such. And however, I think where the ethical dimension might come into a picture is from the language itself, from the concept itself. So if we start talking about mass crimes or genocide, I think normally it is something ethically bad. I can't imagine, of course, someone might construct, but I really can't imagine any sensible ethical theory that would say that, well, let's do it. So even sort of the concepts are normatively loaded in this sense. But again, we don't get a difference between 1 and 2. So that's my question. Is there a quality difference, or where the additional ethical dimension comes into the picture?
Okay, so I would say uniqueness 1 is actually what you started with. So every historical event is unique. Every event has particular features, and uniqueness 2 would be the result of a balancing process of these particularities, leading to the statement, okay, the Shoah was particularly monstrous, horrifying, and has a particular significance. So I think this is uniqueness 2, or the uniqueness thesis as it is used. So I would say that there's an obvious difference between the two statements. The one is put it very easy, very simplistic. The one, uniqueness 1, is about facts established by comparisons, historical comparison. Uniqueness 2 is a value judgment, and so value judgment and factual statements are obviously different. So I think for me it's clear that there's a difference between uniqueness 1 and uniqueness 2. Perhaps your question is why should we engage with uniqueness 2? Why should we not stay with uniqueness 1, be happy with uniqueness 1? I would say I have two replies on this. The first is, actually, historians, even if they do not admit it, they engage factually in this kind of uniqueness 2. They make value judgments. For example, if they say, okay, the Holocaust was an extreme case, this is Dan Stone. Dan Stone is a critic of the uniqueness thesis, but he makes this kind of value judgment. I would say extreme in this context is a thick ethical term, nothing else. And it informs is essential to a value judgment. So historians actually do this. So for this reason, it has a kind of significance, and we have to engage with it. And the second argument is, okay, if from the Holocaust, from the Shoah, follows something, a kind of learning, or the never again of the Shoah, then of course we have to engage, or yes, we have to deal with this normativity. And I would say this universalist never again, this is important, and this may be part of creating a better world. So this may sound naive, but even when growing older, I am not willing to to abandon this kind of naivety.
Thank you.
Okay, I think these are some fitting closing words, perhaps. I mean, I think we can leave it at this. I would have had a question too on the comparative value judgment, exactly what this, but we can leave it at this. As for the moment, as I said before, we will be staying on a bit on here in a more informal setting. So please stay on with us if you feel like. And of course, thank you very much for joining. Thank you very much for your comments and questions. And thank you very much, Urs, also especially to you for your talk today. Until next time.
Thank you. Thank you for your participations, and the discussion was a great pleasure. And hope to see you again at whatever event.